Well, there's so much discussion in our world today about racism, and recently, an interesting claim in an article has been trying to get some traction that's denying evolution is a form of white supremacy. So, joining us from Southern California to share the details is Dr. Fazale Rana, the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. He is a biochemist and is the author of Thinking About Evolution. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rana.
Thanks so much for having me. It's so kind of you to bring me on.
Oh, absolutely. Now, can you explain where this idea comes from that denial of evolution is a form of white supremacy?
Yeah, well, as you pointed out, there was an article published just recently as an op-ed piece for Scientific American by Allison Hooper, where she made that very strong claim. But the fact of the matter is that over the years, organizations like the National Center for Science Education, which is an evolution advocacy group and an anti-creationist organization, has tried to establish an association between creationism and racism, but they've never gone so far as to say that there is a direct correlation or a direct cause. And so this is, something that Allison Hooper has done that has really pushed things, I think, to the extreme.
Yeah, interesting. So, is it true that biblical creation suggests a white Adam and Eve? I mean, we don't actually know their race or color of their skin, do we? Was that ever documented?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And the whole idea of again, creationism being connected with racism and white supremacy really stems back to the mid 1800s in the United States, when you had Christians who were pro-slavery trying to produce an apologetic justifying slavery based on the biblical text. And as part of that, they made the argument that people of dark skin either reflected the mark of Cain or the curse of Ham, with the idea that people with dark skin were not favored by God, and that people with white skin were in a better standing with God. And that was used to justify slavery. Of course, at that time, there were also Christians who were abolitionists who countered that really flawed interpretation of the first 11 chapters of Genesis. But this idea sadly has persisted into the 20th century after the emancipation, and particularly in the South among fundamentalists and evangelicals. So this is where that association comes from. But as you're pointing out, the biblical text isn't that specific. It doesn't tell us anything about the physical appearance of Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel or any of the human beings that we encounter in Scripture, any of the characters we encounter in Scripture. The text is silent about their physical appearance. So any idea of where racial diversity comes from the biblical text is an inference at best.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're saying geographically and historically, the Bible actually doesn't say anything about, Adam and Eve's, what they actually first looked like, does it? That's an interesting point that you make. So did the author of this article consider the fact that there may very well be more non-white humans who believe in creationism rather, as compared to white people?
Again, a very strong point. I don't have the precise statistics in front of me, but there's about 2.3 billion people in the world that are Christians. This is about a third of the world's population. And I think it's safe to say roughly 2/3 of those people that identify with Christianity would be considered to be non-white. And of course, creation is a central doctrine in Christianity. And if that's the case, then you have a significant portion of the world's population, maybe 1.4, 1.5 billion people who are non-white, who would believe that God created human beings in his image. And so that's a creationist position. So just simply the population statistics, argue against the idea that creationism is a form of white supremacy. And by the way, just as an interesting aside, there's about 2 billion Muslims in the world, and Muslims are creationists as well. And many Muslims, again, would be considered non-white. So when you add Islam into the mix, there's a significant portion of the non-white world that would hold to some version of creation where there is an Adam and an Eve that all humanity comes from.
Very, very interesting point that you make there, Dr. Rana. Now, the article professes that the first wave of legal fights against the teaching of evolution were by the KKK. Therefore, affirming creationism devalues people of color. So, on the other hand, you, Dr. Rana, believe that it's Darwinian evolution that minimizes the value of all humans, as where the biblical human origins model it sort of elevates it. So can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, and it is true that the KKK was the first organization historically to oppose teaching evolution in the classroom. But the KKK had an interesting set of views where some of their ideas they bolstered from, again, this slave apologetics, but other ideas they were appropriating was from social Darwinism, where they saw essentially natural selection being the reason why white groups were superior to people of color. And to interfere with that would be to go against the natural order of things. And so the KKK had a really interesting amalgam of views. But what is missed in this article is that it's not just simply people that espouse creationism that held white supremacist views. So did evolutionary biologists who were part of human evolutionary anthropology. If you go back in the history of anthropology, all the way back to Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, you see Darwin espousing really white supremacist ideas, where he believed that the different racial groups were evidence that human beings evolved and that people of color were actually not as far evolved as white Europeans. And in fact, Darwin refers to non-white people groups as savages, where he argues that they were intellectually and morally inferior to white Europeans. They lacked self-command. And he even argues for British imperialism on the basis of the difference in, he saw, capabilities between different racial groups. Or if you continue, you have the ideas of Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism that, again, espoused a form of white supremacy. Or you look at Carlton Kuhn and his ideas of multi-regionalism and identifying not only different racial groups, but then ranking them based on skin color according to how far evolved he considered them to be, where again, of course, white Europeans were more evolved. So this idea of white supremacy is the issue, where you see people appropriating science or appropriating the biblical text to try to justify white supremacist views, whereas I think neither actually scientifically or biblically support those views. And it's really Christianity that views all human beings being made in God's image, coming from a historical Adam and Eve, that ultimately, I think, give you justification for seeing racial unity and racial harmony in the world.
Oh, that's interesting. By the way, what do we know about these white supremacists? Is there any evidence that the majority of them actually believe in creationism?
I really don't know the answer to that really good question. I'm not an expert by any means on the different white supremacist groups, but I would imagine that ultimately these groups are going to have to justify their beliefs in white supremacy based on probably some kind of amalgam of a distorted view of scripture and really a type of social Darwinism, where again, you would see the white race as being more evolved. So again, very similar to how the KKK would justify white supremacy. That would be my guess.
Mm-hmm. So for viewers who may doubt creation, are you able to share a few thoughts on some scientific, logical reasons why they maybe wouldn't believe in Darwinian evolution?
Well, I mean, the first thing that you see when you look at biological systems is this overwhelming appearance of design and design for a purpose. And of course, if something appears to be designed for a purpose, maybe indeed it has been. And so it's completely reasonable, I think, to look at biological systems and think that there is a mind, a creator that's responsible for those systems. But on top of that, there are certain aspects of evolutionary biology that are not well evidenced. For example, we look at the key transitions in life's history, the origin of life, the origin of what are called eukaryotic cells, the origin of complex multicellularity in animals, and hence the origin of body plans, or the origin of consciousness, or even the origin of human exceptionalism. None of these areas have robust, valid evolutionary explanations. And in fact, the researchers that work in these areas will be the first to acknowledge we don't have an explanation for these important transitions. So to be skeptical of at least aspects of the evolutionary paradigm isn't unreasonable, and to see a creator's handiwork in the creation, again, is completely reasonable.
Interesting. Now, do you know if belief in creation is on the rise or on the decline in North America?
It's pretty much held steady over the last 40 or 50 years. I mean, today, I think the latest statistics I saw was about 40% of people would say that Adam and Eve were created in their, or human beings, I'm sorry, were created in their current form. They would hold to a historical Adam and Eve. About 35% of people say God used evolution as a way to create. Roughly three-fourths of the US population hold to some version of creationism. And it's really about 25% of people that see evolution as unguided. And those numbers have largely remained constant over the last 40 years. Maybe about 40 years ago, the numbers would be slightly higher for people that espoused the view that humanity was created in its original form from a historical Adam and Eve. So it's a slight dip, but it's not that much of a change. So a significant part of the US population holds to some version of creationism.
All right. Well, it looks like we're about out of time, but thank you so much for your time today and your opinions and your expertise on that, Dr. Rana.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Dr. Fazale Rana is the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe, and is the author of Thinking About Evolution at www.reasons.org. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.